Marcus Vale didn't even look up from his ledger when she walked in. He just laughed. Not the polite kind a man swallows when he catches himself. The loud, open kind. The kind that fills a room and makes everyone in it feel they have permission to join. "Lord Almighty," he said, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair, like a man watching something that amused him greatly. He looked Eliza Harper up and down the way a person examines something they're deciding whether to throw away. "They're sending me this to run a kitchen." The room went quiet. 3 men at the counter stopped chewing. Eliza stood in the doorway of the Dust Hollow Hotel with her small suitcase at her feet and her mother's cast-iron skillet wrapped in cloth under one arm. She was 27 years old. She was heavy in the way that made strangers feel entitled to comment. And she had just traveled 4 days by wagon across Wyoming territory in October, when the wind comes off the mountains like it has a personal grudge. She hadn't asked for his charity. She'd asked about the kitchen position she'd read about in the Cheyenne Gazette. Marcus Vale stood up slowly, the way powerful men do when they want you to watch them rise. He walked toward her. He stopped close enough that she could smell the tobacco and bay rum on him. "You want to cook?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. "Yes, sir." "For my guests." "That's what the advertisement said." He smiled at her like she'd just said something childish. Then he reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a key on a rusted ring, and held it out without touching her hand. "There's an old kitchen behind the freight barn," he said. "It hasn't been used in 3 years. The stove's busted, floor's dirt. Door doesn't close all the way." He paused. "It's yours." She looked at the key. "You're serious," she said. "I'm being generous," he said. "You want a chance in Dust Hollow? There it is." He walked back to his desk. Conversation over. Every person in that room was watching her, waiting for the part where she picked up her suitcase and walked back out into the road. That was the story they expected. That was the one that made sense. Eliza picked up the key. If you've ever been handed something broken and told to be grateful for it, if you've ever stood in a room full of people waiting for you to give up, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next in Dust Hollow, nobody saw it coming. The key was cold, and it didn't fit smoothly. Eliza had to jiggle it twice before the padlock gave, and even then the door swung open only halfway before it caught on the uneven ground and stopped. She had to turn sideways to get inside. She stood in the middle of what Marcus Vale had called a kitchen. It was a single room. The floor was packed dirt with 2 boards rotting near the far wall. The stove in the corner was a mid-sized cast-iron range that had been good once. She could see that. But the left burner plate was cracked clean through and someone had jammed a piece of tin over the firebox door to keep it from falling open. There was a shelf on one wall, half of it collapsed, holding nothing but a rusted coffee tin and the dried-up body of something small that had probably not survived the previous winter. One window, no glass. A piece of canvas had been nailed over it, and the canvas was loose at one corner, lifting and dropping in the wind with a sound like someone slowly turning a page. Eliza set her suitcase down. She set the skillet on the broken shelf, the one piece of it still level. She stood there for a long moment. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily, but she was also not the kind who pretended things weren't what they were. This was genuinely bad. She had $17.40. She knew no one in Dust Hollow. She had walked into a room full of men who just watched another man hand her a ruin and call it an opportunity, and not one of them had said a word in her defense. She pressed her fingers against the stove. Cold iron, thick with old grease and dust. She thought about her mother. Her mother had cooked for 40 years on a stove not much better than this one, had fed 7 children and a husband, and, on Sundays, whoever happened to be passing through. She had never once called it a hardship. She called it a skill. She said, "A bad kitchen doesn't make bad food. A bad cook does." Eliza pulled her coat tighter. "All right," she said to nobody. She meant it. She spent the first night not sleeping. She was too cold and too busy making a list. She sat on her suitcase with a stub of pencil and a piece of paper she'd folded twice and wrote down everything the kitchen would need before she could cook a single meal in it. The list was long. The money she had was not. In the morning, she went to the general store. The man behind the counter was named Hobart, and he had the particular expression of someone who'd already decided not to be helpful before she'd finished walking through the door. She told him she needed basic repair supplies. He quoted her prices that were about 30% higher than she'd paid in Cheyenne. She didn't argue. She couldn't afford to make enemies she didn't have to. She bought what she could and carried it back herself because hiring help would have cost her $2 she didn't have. What she found out on that first walk through Dust Hollow was this. The town was not a bad town exactly. It was a tired one. It had the feel of a place that had been almost something and then hadn't quite made it. There were 2 saloons, a blacksmith shop, the hotel, the general store, a dry goods store, and a post office that also operated as a telegraph station. Maybe 200 people, give or take. A freighting route ran through the middle of it, which meant travelers passed through regularly. Wagons, miners coming down from the hills, cattlemen moving through to market, which meant there were people who needed to eat. That mattered. She walked back to the kitchen, set down her supplies, and started pulling boards. The blacksmith was a man named Elias Crow. She found him that first afternoon when she went looking for someone who could tell her whether the stove was salvageable or just decorative. He was a tall man, somewhere around 40, with forearms like bundled rope and a way of listening that made you feel he was actually doing it rather than just waiting for you to stop talking. He had a Cherokee grandmother and a Scots-Irish grandfather, and somewhere in between had ended up here, alone in a frontier town, making things out of metal and minding his own business with considerable commitment. She explained the stove problem. He didn't ask her what a woman was doing trying to fix a kitchen behind the freight barn. He just said he'd come look at it that evening. He came. He looked. Left burner plate's cracked, he said. I can cast you a new one. Take 2 days. What will that cost? He named a figure. She winced. Is there a version of that where I pay you half now and half once I'm making money? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, which meant when he did talk, you paid attention. Half now, he said. Half when you've got it. I appreciate that. Don't thank me yet. Still might not draw right even with a new plate. Flue could be blocked. Is the flue blocked? He reached up and banged the side of the stovepipe twice with the flat of his hand. A sound came back from inside that was not the hollow ring of a clear pipe. Yes, he said. She laughed. She couldn't help it. It was not a cheerful laugh. It was the kind that comes out when a situation is so comprehensively bad that your body has to do something with it, or you'll just stand there making the face of a person drowning. Elias watched her laugh. He didn't join her, but something in his expression shifted slightly, the way a door opens an inch without committing to anything. I can sort the flue too, he said. Same arrangement. By the end of the first week, she had the stove working well enough to boil water and hold a moderate heat. By the end of the second, Elias had brought her 2 extra lengths of freight board, and she'd fashioned a makeshift counter along one wall. She'd bought a piece of oilcloth at Hobart's store, the cheapest one, a muddy brown color with a faded pattern that might have been leaves, and laid it over the boards to keep the splinters down. She'd also plugged the gaps in the door frame with rags and rehung the door on a new leather hinge Elias made for her, which meant the draft no longer came in at knee level every time the wind picked up. It still looked like a poor woman's kitchen, because it was, but it smelled better, and the heat stayed in. She made herself a meal that second Friday, just salt pork and roasted potatoes, nothing she'd serve to anyone. And she sat on the one stool she'd found in a trash heap behind the freight barn and ate every bite. She'd bought flour, lard, salt, and dried beans. She'd found a root cellar under a wooden hatch in the floor she hadn't noticed the first day, and inside it, miraculously, 3 unbroken crocks, a string of dried onions someone had left behind, and 2 small kegs that still held a residue of vinegar. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. The first customer wasn't technically a customer. He was a freighter named Sully, big man, red beard, traveling alone, because his 2-person rig had a broken axle somewhere east of town, and he'd walked in carrying a pack that weighed more than some children. He tried the hotel dining room, which Marcus Vale ran with a cook named Pete, who was technically competent and temperamentally hostile to effort. The meal had been adequate and expensive. Sully had been in the hotel and seen the look on Pete's face when he asked for seconds, and had decided he'd rather find somewhere else for breakfast. Someone, she never found out who, had told him there was a woman cooking behind the freight barn. He knocked on her door at 7 in the morning. She was already up. She was always already up. She had bread rising near the stove and a pot of beans going slowly, and she'd been testing a batch of biscuits she'd been adjusting since Tuesday. She opened the door. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Someone said you're cooking," he said. "I am." "What have you got?" "Biscuits, beans, salt pork, coffee." He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "How much?" She named a price that was lower than the hotel and felt her stomach tighten as she said it, because she'd done the math, and it was barely going to cover the ingredients. He came in. Sat down at the single table. She'd built it herself out of those freight boards, still rough, still slightly uneven because one leg was an inch shorter than the others, and she'd shimmed it with a folded piece of leather. He sat down and she set a tin cup of coffee in front of him and a plate of biscuits. He picked up a biscuit. I was a man who ate the way men eat when they've been working hard, efficiently, without ceremony, paying attention only to whether the thing was worth eating. He stopped. He picked up the biscuit again and looked at it like it had done something unexpected. "What's in these?" he asked. "Flour, lard, buttermilk, bit of rendered bacon fat, salt." "They're—" He paused. He was not, she could tell, a man accustomed to discussing food beyond edible or inedible. "These are real good," he finally said. She kept her face neutral, but she felt something ease in her chest. He ate 4 biscuits. He finished the pork and beans, he asked for more coffee, and she gave it to him. When he left, he put the right money on the table and then stood at the door for a moment. "I'll be through again in about 3 weeks, he said. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded and left. She stood in the kitchen alone for a minute after he was gone. Just stood there. Then she went back to work. It happened slowly, and then it happened fast. A wagon driver named Cal came in the following Wednesday and ordered breakfast. He brought his partner the week after. The partner, a woman named Ruth, who drove for the same freight company and had biceps that would have impressed Elias Crow, declared the coffee was the best she'd had since leaving Ohio and asked if Eliza could pack them a lunch to take on the road. Eliza had never thought about road lunches. She thought about it for about 4 seconds and said yes. She charged accordingly. Ruth spread the word. By the 4th week, Eliza was feeding an average of 6 people a day, some days more. The kitchen was not built for it. She was cooking on a stove with 3 functional burners, serving from 1 rough counter, with 2 mismatched chairs and a bench she'd borrowed from Elias's shop because he wasn't using it. People didn't seem to care. They sat on what she had, and they ate what she made, and most of them thanked her in a way that felt genuine rather than obligatory. She started buying more supplies. She renegotiated terms with Hobart, who was still suspicious of her but was increasingly aware that she was a regular and reliable customer and therefore worth not alienating. She made a pie. This was, in retrospect, the turning point, though she wouldn't recognize it as such until later. It was an apple pie, made with dried apples she'd found in the general store, and supplemented with a little molasses because fresh apples in Dust Hollow in late October were not something money could necessarily solve. She'd used her mother's recipe, which had a crust that used a small amount of vinegar to keep it short, and a filling spiced with cinnamon, a whisper of nutmeg, and just enough brown sugar that you could taste it without being hit over the head with sweetness. She put it in the window to cool because the kitchen was too warm. 3 people asked about it before it was done. She sliced it and served it with dinner that evening. The miner who ate the last piece, a grizzled man from somewhere in Colorado who'd said maybe 15 words total across the meal, pushed the empty plate toward her and said, in a completely flat voice, "I want you to know that's the best thing I've eaten since my wife passed." She didn't know what to say to that. "I'm glad," she said, finally. He nodded once and put his hat on and walked out. She cleared his plate and stood at the counter for a minute, looking at nothing in particular. Marcus Vale noticed. She didn't know exactly when he started paying attention, probably earlier than she realized. But by the 6th week, she became aware that he was watching. She'd catch him sometimes standing near the freight barn in the early mornings, not doing anything specific, just present in a way that felt deliberate. He hadn't said anything to her since the day he'd handed her the key. She expected he thought that situation would resolve itself without his intervention. It wasn't resolving itself. The hotel dining room had lost at least 4 regular customers to her kitchen. She knew this because those customers told her. Not to be cruel about it, They didn't know it would matter. But because people talk, especially in small towns, and in Dust Hollow there wasn't enough entertainment to make anyone careful about what they let slip. She heard it first from the barber's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara, who came in for pie one Thursday afternoon, and sat across from Eliza and talked with the frankness that women sometimes share when they're certain they're speaking to someone who can handle the truth. "Marcus is telling people you're running an unlicensed establishment," Clara said. She was eating her pie with a fork she'd brought herself because Eliza only had 3 forks, and 2 of them were already in use. "He went to the town council last week." Eliza kept her hands busy wiping down the counter. "What did the council say?" "Nothing yet. You haven't got enough money for them to care about you either way." Clara took another bite. "Yet." "Yet," Eliza repeated. "He's also putting it around that your kitchen isn't clean, that you don't know what you're doing." Clara looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because you should know what's moving through the air." "I appreciate that." "Don't." Clara finished her pie and folded her hands on the table. "I'm telling you because I like the pie, and I want you to still be making it in the spring. That's the entire extent of my altruism." Eliza almost smiled. "Understood." That. She started keeping notes on what sold. She noted which dishes brought people back and which ones people ate once and didn't request again. She noted weather, because weather affected who came through and what they wanted. Cold days, they wanted something heavy and warm. Days with a hint of coming spring, they'd ask for lighter things, fresher tastes. She learned that she had a particular talent she hadn't thought much about before coming west. She remembered what people liked. If a man came in and mentioned he didn't like onions in his hash, she remembered that. If a woman asked once if she could get her coffee with just a little less chicory, she remembered that too. This was not calculation on Eliza's part. It was just how her mind worked, the same way her mother's had. But in Dust Hollow, in a place where people felt largely unremarkable and unremarked upon, being remembered, genuinely, not performed, was a kind of currency she hadn't known she possessed. Sully came back in his 3 weeks. She had coffee poured before he sat down. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He didn't say anything. But he sat differently than he had the first time. A small thing, the way a man's shoulders drop when he walks into a room he's decided he can trust. That was the thing nobody expected from the woman behind the freight barn. She wasn't just feeding people. She was paying attention to them. And in a hard country full of hard years and people who mostly passed through without stopping, being truly paid attention to tasted better than anything she could put on a plate. What Marcus Vale was planning in response to all of this, the thing that would arrive like a winter storm, unexpected in its ferocity and its timing, she didn't yet know. But the kitchen was warm. The stove was drawing right. The pie was cooling on the sill. And Eliza Harper, the girl no one in Dust Hollow had believed in, was still standing. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. Eliza found it nailed to the kitchen door when she came back from Hobart's store with a sack of cornmeal balanced against her hip and 24 eggs wrapped carefully in a cloth inside her coat pocket. She'd been in a decent mood. Hobart had finally, grudgingly, agreed to extend her a small line of credit, which meant she could buy ingredients on Monday and pay on Friday when the week's earnings came in. It wasn't much. But it was the difference between being able to plan and being at the mercy of whatever cash she happened to have on a given morning. She set down the cornmeal. She read the notice twice. It was from the Dust Hollow Town Council, signed by a man named Alderman Greer, and it informed her in formal, bureaucratic language that her establishment was operating without a proper commercial food license, that said license would cost $14 to obtain, and that she had 30 days to either produce the license or vacate the premises. $14. She had $9.70. She stood at the door for a long time. The wind was blowing in from the northwest, and it had the particular edge that came in November, the kind that found the gaps in your coat no matter how well you'd buttoned it. She read the notice a third time, as if the number might change. It didn't. She went inside, lit the stove, and started a pot of coffee, because she'd learned that problems looked slightly less catastrophic once you had something hot in your hands and she had work to do in an hour, regardless of what the notice said. She thought about Clara's warning. He went to the town council. She'd known something was coming. She just hadn't known what shape it would take or how expensive it would be. $14 was not an impossible sum, but it was more than she had, and Elias still had the back half of his payment coming, and she owed Hobart for this week's cornmeal and the canvas she'd patched the window with had finally given up entirely in last week's wind, and she needed actual glass or at minimum a proper wooden shutter before winter came in hard. She sat down on her stool and pressed both hands around the coffee cup. She did the arithmetic the way you do when you already know the answer isn't going to be what you want. Slowly, carefully, hoping you've made an error somewhere that will turn out in your favor. She hadn't. After the license, after Elias, after Hobart, she'd have somewhere near 40 cents to her name. 40 cents and a working stove. "All right," she said again, to nobody, the same way she'd said it on the first day. She meant it the same way, too. She went to see Alderman Greer the next morning. His office was a room attached to the back of the post office, small and warm and smelling of pipe tobacco and old paper. Greer himself was a heavy-set man in his 50s with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and the expression of someone who dealt primarily in unpleasant conversations and had made a kind of peace with that. She sat down across from his desk without being invited to and placed the notice flat on the wood between them. "I got this yesterday," she said. He glanced at it. "Then you know the situation." "I know the situation. I want to know if there's flexibility in the timeline." He leaned back. 30 days is 30 days, Miss Harper. "I understand that. I'm asking if there's a provision for a payment arrangement. Half now, half in 2 weeks." He looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without aggression. She'd learned that with men who had small amounts of institutional power, aggression got you nowhere. Steadiness was better. Steadiness made them uncertain. "That's not standard procedure," he said. "I'm aware. I'm asking if it's possible." He picked up the notice, looked at it, put it down. He was the kind of man, she decided, who wasn't fundamentally unkind. He just operated inside a system that rewarded looking the other way, and he'd gotten comfortable there. "I can give you 45 days, he said finally. "Full amount. That's the most I can do within council authority." It wasn't a payment arrangement, but it was 2 more weeks. "Thank you," she said. She picked up the notice and folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She walked back to the kitchen and started breakfast service. What she did not yet know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Marcus Vale had paid for the license filing personally. Not in money directly, but in a favor called in with Alderman Greer over a card game the previous Thursday evening. He'd also gone to Hobart and suggested, with the casual authority of a man who owned the largest establishment in town, that extending credit to the woman in the freight barn kitchen might not be a sound financial decision. Hobart had listened. He'd nodded. He had then done nothing about it because Hobart was, at his core, a businessman, and Eliza Harper paid on time and bought consistently, and those facts mattered more to him than Marcus Vale's opinion. But Marcus didn't know that yet. He was operating on the assumption that squeezing her from 2 directions at once, licensing pressure from above and supply pressure from below, would produce the result he wanted, which was simple. He wanted her gone. Not because she'd done anything to him, not technically, but because she existed in a way that made him look smaller, and Marcus Vale had not spent 20 years building himself into the most important man in Dust Hollow to be made to feel small by a 27-year-old woman cooking out of a shack behind his freight barn. He told himself it was about fair competition. He told himself it was about standards. It wasn't about either of those things. Well, the day everything shifted started ordinarily enough. Eliza had a full morning, 6 customers at breakfast, which was becoming her usual, and 2 road lunches packed for a pair of wagon drivers heading north. She'd made a corn cake that morning, experimenting with adding a small amount of rendered bacon fat to the batter, and it had come out better than she'd expected. Dense enough to hold up, but not heavy, with a slight crispness at the edges, that the first man who tried it had responded to by asking if there was more. There was more. There was always a calculation involved in whether she could afford to give it. She was in the middle of washing up when Elias came by, which was unusual. He generally came in the evenings, and only when he had something to say or a repair to discuss, not for social calls. He was not a man who made social calls. He ducked through the door. He was tall enough that the doorframe required a slight adjustment, and stood with his hat in his hands. "Heard something this morning," he said. She kept washing. "About the license?" "About the license and about Hobart. Someone's been working against you." She set down the tin plate she was holding. "Tell me." He told her what he'd heard. Not everything, because he'd only heard pieces. the kind of fragments that move through a small town in whispers and partial sentences. But the shape of it was clear enough. Marcus had made moves. The license was not a routine council action. It had been prompted. She stood very still while he talked. This was a thing she did when she was angry. Went still, the way water goes still before it changes state. "How solid is this?" she asked. "Solid enough that I'm telling you." She nodded. She picked the plate back up and finished washing it. She dried it. She set it on the shelf. "Thank you," she said. "What are you going to do?" She looked at him. "Make enough money to pay the license." He watched her. "That's it?" "That's it." She paused. "What did you think I was going to do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. Something that would get you in trouble, maybe." "I can't afford trouble," she said. "I can only afford to work." He put his hat back on and left. She stood in the kitchen alone and felt the anger sitting in her chest like a coal. Hot, dense, patient. She wasn't going to do anything reckless with it, but she was going to use it. She grabbed her coat. She had an idea. The idea was Ruth. Ruth, the freight driver who'd declared Eliza's coffee the best since Ohio, was due through Dust Hollow again that week. Eliza had been thinking about what Ruth had said on her second visit, something she'd filed away and not fully considered yet. That the mining camps north of town had no decent food, and the men up there would pay well for anything edible that wasn't hardtack. She waited at the freight road on Thursday afternoon until she saw Ruth's wagon coming. Ruth pulled up, looked down at her from the seat. "You look like a woman with a proposition," Ruth said. "I have a proposition," Eliza confirmed. Ruth climbed down. They stood at the side of the road and Eliza laid it out. She would prepare packaged meals, wrapped in cloth, things that traveled well, dense and filling, and Ruth would carry them north on her next run and sell them to the mining camps at a marked-up price, splitting the difference with Eliza. Ruth listened. She had the listening quality of someone who'd done a lot of business in difficult places and knew the difference between a bad deal and a good one. "What kind of food travels 3 days in cold weather?" Ruth asked. "Hard biscuits, dried meat pies, salt pork wrapped in cornbread. Things that are better on day 2 than day 1 if you keep them cold." Ruth squinted. "You can actually make something that's better on day 2? "Some things, yes." Ruth thought about it. She looked at the road. She looked back at Eliza. "I'd need to try them first," she said. "Come by tomorrow morning." Ruth came by the next morning. She ate 2 biscuits, half a meat pie, and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cornbread that had been sitting since the previous afternoon. She ate slowly and deliberately, the way someone does when they're making a genuine assessment rather than being polite. She looked up. "How many can you make in a week?" The next 3 weeks were the hardest she'd worked since arriving in Dust Hollow. She was getting up before 4 in the morning now. The kitchen ran all day. Breakfast service, midday service, and then the production work for Ruth's cargo in the evenings. She was going through ingredients faster than she could comfortably afford, but the money from the mining camp sales came back within a week, and it was more than she'd expected. The miners paid. They paid well. Not because they were generous men, most of them weren't particularly, but because decent food in an indecent place is worth more than its ingredients, and they knew it. She made the license payment on day 38, 6 days before the extended deadline Greer had given her. She paid the full $14 in cash, counted out on Greer's desk with the particular satisfaction of a person completing something they were not supposed to be able to complete. Greer looked at the money. He looked at her. He wrote her a receipt without saying much. She walked out of his office and down the main street of Dust Hollow, with the license receipt folded in her coat pocket next to the original notice. 2 pieces of paper. 1 problem. Solved. She let herself feel it for exactly 1 block. Then she went back to work. It was Clara who told her about Marcus Vale's face when he found out she'd paid. Clara came in for her Thursday pie. It had become a standing appointment, though neither of them called it that, and settled herself at the table and said, without preamble, he turned a particular shade of red when Greer told him. Eliza poured her coffee. "You were there?" "I was at the telegraph counter when he came in. Greer's office door was open." Clara accepted the coffee with the practiced ease of a woman who had always assumed she deserved decent service. "He didn't say much. That's the part that should concern you." Eliza sat down across from her. "Why?" Because when men like Marcus Vales say nothing, they're deciding something. Clara cut into her pie. The license was a visible move. It didn't work. The next one won't be visible. Eliza thought about this. What would you do? She asked. Clara looked up. She seemed slightly surprised to have been asked. Me? I'd make sure I had something he couldn't take away. What does that mean? It means customers are one thing. Customers can be scared off or slandered off or inconvenienced off. She took a bite of pie and chewed it thoughtfully. But reputation is different. Reputation travels on its own. It doesn't need you to carry it. Eliza nodded slowly. You need people talking about this place in towns that aren't Dust Hollow, Clara said. Freighters, travelers, people who are moving, not staying. They carry news better than any newspaper. She already knew this. Ruth was part of that, and the word coming back from the mining camps. But Clara was describing something more deliberate, and Eliza understood the distinction. That evening, she sat with her list and her stub of pencil and thought carefully. She made a decision that week that cost her more than it should have and paid back more than she'd expected. There was a family, husband, wife, 3 children, who'd been camped at the edge of town for 4 days trying to fix a broken wagon wheel. The husband was doing the repair himself because they couldn't afford the blacksmith's rate, and it was taking 4 days because he was not a man who knew how to fix wagon wheels and was learning through the particular education of breaking something worse before you fix it right. Eliza knew they were there because she could see their camp from the freight road when she made her morning water run. She knew they weren't eating well because the children had the look of children who'd been on trail rations for too long. Not starving, but hollow in a specific way that comes from too many days of the same bad food. She made a pot of stew. She added cornbread. She carried it out to their camp. The wife opened her mouth, probably to explain that they couldn't pay. It's not for pay, Eliza said. She set down the pot and the wrapped cornbread and a stack of tin bowls she'd brought from the kitchen. You've got children. Eat it. The woman looked at her. There was a complicated expression on her face, the kind that comes when someone does something kind in a way that doesn't require anything back, and your first instinct is to be suspicious of it, and your second instinct is to be ashamed of the suspicion. Why? The woman asked. Because someone did it for me once, Eliza said, which was true, though the story behind it was long and not relevant to the moment. She left them to it. The husband came by the next morning and fixed the latch on her kitchen door that had been giving her trouble for 2 weeks. I didn't say anything about payment or exchange. He just fixed it, nodded at her, and went back to his wagon. The family left that afternoon, heading west. The wife told the next 4 people she encountered on the road about the woman cooking behind the freight barn in Dust Hollow. 2 of those 4 people came through Dust Hollow within the following month. Both of them ate at Eliza's table. Clara's lesson. Reputation moves on its own. By mid-November, Eliza was averaging 12 customers a day. On good days, 16. She had scraped together enough to buy a second chair and to finally replace the canvas window covering with a proper wooden shutter that closed against the wind. She'd also bought a bolt of oilcloth, a better quality than the first piece, a dark green, and recovered the counter and the table. It looked, if not exactly welcoming by any standard she would have called high, at least intentional. Like a place someone had thought about rather than just survived in. Elias came by one evening and stood in the doorway and looked around. It's different, he said. Better different or worse different? He considered this with the seriousness he applied to most questions. Better, he said finally. She'd learned to take his one-word affirmation seriously. From Elias Crow, better was extravagant praise. She'd also hired help. This was the decision that had scared her most. Spending money on a person instead of on ingredients. But she'd reached the point where she physically could not do everything alone. The person she hired was a girl named May, 14 years old, daughter of the barber, who showed up the first morning with her sleeves already rolled up and the practical competence of someone who'd grown up in a working household and understood that work was done by doing it rather than discussing it. May washed dishes, carried water, and kept the fire fed. She didn't cook. Eliza kept the cooking to herself. But having her there meant Eliza's hands were free for the stove when they needed to be, which made the difference between manageable and chaotic on busy mornings. May was also observant in the way quiet people often are. She noticed things. One Tuesday, she said, without looking up from the dishes, there was a man standing outside for a while this morning. Didn't come in. What did he look like? well-dressed, big coat. He just stood there and then walked back towards the hotel. Eliza didn't say anything. Should I have said something to him? May asked. No, Eliza said. Let him look. She kept moving. Whoa. The second move Marcus made was more sophisticated than the license, and it came from a direction she hadn't thought to guard. There was a woman in town named Dora Fitch, who ran a small laundry operation out of her house on the east side of Dust Hollow. Dora was not a malicious woman. Eliza had spoken to her twice and found her agreeable enough. But she was a woman who had debts to Marcus Vale, the specific kind of financial debt that made people do things they wouldn't otherwise choose to do. Dora started telling people that she'd heard Eliza's kitchen had a rat problem. She didn't say she'd seen it herself. She was careful about that. She said she'd heard it from someone, and she didn't know if it was true. But you know how these things are with old buildings, especially ones that hadn't been used in years before the current woman took them over. It moved through town the way these things move. Not quickly, but persistently, the way smoke gets into fabric. By the time Eliza heard it, it had passed through 6 people and gained, somewhere along the way, the addition of a specific detail, that a customer had found something in his food. No one could name the customer. No one seemed to know exactly what had been found. But the story had specificity now, which made it feel more real than it was. Eliza heard it from May, who heard it from the barber's other daughter, who'd heard it from a woman at the dry goods store. She put down her knife. She stood at the counter. How many people have you heard say this? She asked May. May thought about it. 4, maybe. People talking about it, not saying it to me directly. 4 was enough. Eliza thought about ignoring it. She thought about confronting Dora Fitch. She thought about going straight to Marcus Vale and saying something she would not be able to unsay. She did none of those things. What she did instead was simpler, and she understood even as she was doing it, more effective than any of the other options. She invited people in. She held what she didn't call an open morning, but what functioned as one. She put the word out through May, who was, Eliza had come to understand, extraordinarily good at moving information through Dust Hollow's social channels, that on Saturday morning she would be making a large breakfast, first come first served, and anyone in town was welcome. She cooked for 2 hours before the first person arrived. She had the stove running at capacity, cornbread in the oven, sausage gravy in the pan, biscuits in batches, coffee, hot and ready. She had everything clean in a way that went beyond her usual standards. She had scrubbed the floor, she had washed the shelf and organized it. She had put a small bundle of dried grasses in a tin on the table because she didn't have flowers, and dried grasses were at least something. Clara came. Elias came, which surprised her. Hobart came, which surprised her considerably more. Sully was in town. His axle had broken again, apparently a recurring problem with his rig. And he showed up with his red beard freshly trimmed and ate 3 plates of biscuits and gravy without pausing. 21 people came through her kitchen that Saturday morning. Not one of them found a rat. What they found was a clean, warm room and a woman who fed them well and looked them in the eye and didn't make them feel they were doing her a favor by eating there. The story about the rat problem slowed down. It didn't stop entirely. Rumors rarely die clean, but it lost its authority. It became something people had heard rather than something people believed. Dora Fitch did not come to the open morning, but the following week she sent her daughter, who was 7, with a small package of dried herbs she'd grown herself, the kind you'd bring to a neighbor, not an enemy. Eliza accepted it. She used the herbs in a soup 2 days later. She did not mention Dora's name to anyone. There was a version of this story where she confronted Marcus Vale directly, where she stood in the middle of his hotel and said exactly what she knew and what she thought of it. She'd imagined that version several times. It was satisfying to imagine. It would also have handed him exactly what he wanted, a scene, evidence that she was difficult, hysterical, a troublemaker. Men like Marcus Vale collected those moments the way other men collected debts. You didn't give them the material. You made them irrelevant instead. December came in hard, the way Wyoming Decembers do. No gradual transition, just a morning when you woke up and the world had changed its mind about temperature entirely. Eliza had laid in extra wood and extra supplies, and she'd done the calculations on what she could reasonably keep cooking through the worst of winter. The answer was most things. The cold was actually useful for some preparations. She'd started hanging meat to cure in the back corner of the root cellar, following a method her mother's older sister had used, And the results were good. Preserved pork that she could slice thin and serve with bean soup, the kind of meal that cost her relatively little to make and filled a person in a way that the cold demanded. Sully's rig was still broken. He'd given up waiting for a specific part to come from Cheyenne and had commissioned Elias to fabricate something approximate, which Elias could do but which took time. So Sully was in town for what turned out to be nearly 2 weeks, and he ate at Eliza's kitchen every day. He was not a talkative man. She was not a talkative woman. They developed a kind of comfortable routine. He arrived, she poured coffee without being asked. He ate whatever she'd made that morning, he paid and thanked her and left. On the 8th day, he arrived and sat down and said, without preamble, "I'm going to tell people about this place. When I get moving again." She looked at him. "I tell other drivers," he said, "routes, road conditions, where to water horses, where to eat. I'll tell them about here." "I'd appreciate that," she said. "It's not charity." He was specific about this in the way people are when they want you to understand they're not trying to help you out of pity. Your food is worth the telling. She poured herself a cup of coffee, something she rarely did during service, and sat down across from him. "Why did you come back the second time?" she asked. "You could have eaten at the hotel." He shrugged. "The biscuits," he said. And he stopped. He seemed to be deciding whether to say the next thing. "You remembered, I don't take sugar in my coffee. First time, second time, that's all." She nodded. "That's a small thing," she said. "Small things are what make a place," he said. He picked up his cup. She picked up hers. They drank in the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other without requiring a performance of it. Outside, the wind was building again. The cold was pressing at the shutter she'd installed, finding the edges, looking for a way in. The stove was putting out solid heat, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the remains of the morning's biscuits. She thought about the license notice. She thought about the $14, and what it had cost her to produce them. She thought about the rat story, and Dora Fitch's dried herbs, and Clara's advice about reputation traveling on its own. She thought about Marcus Vale standing outside in the cold, looking at a lit window. She was still here, and the kitchen was full. The thing about a quiet enemy is that you stop expecting the loud move. Eliza had watched Marcus Vale do nothing visible for 6 weeks. No notices, no rumors she could trace back to him directly. No visits, no messages, no encounters on the street beyond the occasional distant sighting. Him walking toward the hotel, her walking toward the store, both of them pretending the other was part of the scenery. She'd begun to wonder, in the way you wonder about a pain that stopped hurting, whether the danger had passed, or whether she just couldn't feel it anymore. It hadn't passed. She found out on a Wednesday morning in the second week of January, when she went to Hobart's store at 6:30 to pick up the flour order she'd placed on Monday. 50 pounds, same as every week now. Hobart had it set aside for her in the back, always ready when she arrived, because her schedule was consistent and Hobart respected consistency the way a man respects a well-made tool. Except that morning, Hobart was standing behind the counter with his hands flat on the wood and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not unfriendly exactly, but careful in a way that felt rehearsed. "About your order," he said. She waited. "I can't fill it." The store was quiet. A woman was browsing bolts of fabric in the corner and pretending not to listen. "You can't fill a flour order," Eliza said. "I'm out of flour." She looked past him at the shelf. There were 3 50-pound sacks of flour visible from where she was standing. She looked back at him. Hobart had the grace to look uncomfortable. He didn't look away, but the line of his jaw tightened. "Those are spoken for," he said. "By who?" He didn't answer. She understood then. Not all of it, not the full shape of what Marcus had done, but enough. She understood that the 3 sacks of flour on Hobart's shelf had been purchased or claimed by someone who was not going to use them for baking, and that the someone was not going to tell her his name out loud. She stood at the counter for a moment. She kept her voice flat and even. "Is this going to be a recurring situation?" she asked. Hobart said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She nodded once, turned around, and walked out. She stood on the main street of Dust Hollow in January cold, with no flour, and 12 workers scheduled to eat at her kitchen that day. She knew about the workers because she'd arranged it herself. A crew of men hired to repair a section of the freight road north of town had been told about her kitchen by their foreman, who'd eaten there in November, and had sent a message asking if she could feed them lunch for 3 days running. 12 men. She'd said yes because she needed the money and because she'd calculated the ingredients carefully and it had all worked out on paper. The flour had been central to that calculation. She did not allow herself to stand on the street feeling the particular vertigo of a plan collapsing. She gave herself approximately 30 seconds of that, standing in the cold with her breath making small white clouds, and then she started thinking. No flour. 12 men. 4 hours. What she had in the kitchen, potatoes. She'd bought a significant amount before winter, knowing they'd keep dried onions, the last of her cured pork from the root cellar, dried beans that had been soaking since last night, eggs, salt, a small amount of lard, cornmeal. No bread. No biscuits. No pie. She walked back to the kitchen. May arrived at 7 and found Eliza already moving, the stove hot, and every pot she owned in use. "Where's the flour?" May asked, looking at the counter. "There isn't any." May absorbed this. She was a practical girl. "What are we doing for the road crew?" "Something else." She'd decided on a potato and pork hash, built in layers in the cast-iron skillet. The big one, her mother's, that she'd carried from home and never used for daily service because it was too precious to risk. Today, she was using it. She'd fry the potatoes first in rendered pork fat until they had a proper crust, then add the onions, then the pork cut thin, then crack eggs over the whole thing near the end so they set but didn't die. She'd do it in batches. 12 men would need 4, maybe 5 full skillets. Alongside that, she was making a pot of beans, the ones that had been soaking, now going into salted water with the remaining pork scraps, and cornbread, which used cornmeal and eggs and lard and not a grain of flour. It was not what she'd planned. It was not the meal she'd calculated or promised. But it was food, real food, and she could feel as she worked whether it was going to be good or not, the way you feel a piece of wood to know whether it'll hold weight. This would hold. The question was whether 12 men who'd been promised bread would accept a meal that didn't include it. The road crew arrived at noon. They were the kind of men that frontier work produced, weathered, ranging in age from about 20 to somewhere past 50, with the collective energy of people who'd been working hard in cold weather since before dawn and had been thinking about the meal at the end of it. Their foreman was a man named Garrett, compact and efficient in his movements, who'd eaten Eliza's food before and wore the expression of a man who'd vouched for something and was waiting to see if his vouching held. She served them at the table and on 2 benches she'd borrowed again from Elias's shop, and May carried plates while Eliza worked the stove. There wasn't enough seating for all 12 at once, so they went in shifts, 6 at a time, then 6 more. She set the first plate of hash in front of Garrett. He looked at it. He looked up at her. "No bread today?" he said. "No," she said. "Supply issue. This is what I've got." He looked at the plate again. The hash was sitting in a pool of its own fat, the egg yolk broken just slightly at the edge and running amber into the potatoes. The pork was caramelized at the edges, darker than plain salt pork should be, because she'd rendered it slow and let the sugars in the cured fat do their work. He picked up his fork and ate. He didn't say anything for a while. He just ate, with the focus of a man who has temporarily decided that the food in front of him deserves his complete attention. When he was about halfway through, he looked up. "What's in this?" "Potatoes, pork, onions, egg, salt and fat." "That's it?" "That's it." He looked back at his plate. "Huh," he said, which was apparently all he had on the subject. He ate everything. He ate the beans alongside. He ate the cornbread which had come out of the oven with a crust at the bottom that made a sound like a small percussion instrument when you tapped it, and he ate 2 pieces. When he was done, he sat back and had the look of a man who'd been in a mild argument with himself and conceded. "Better than the bread," he said. She didn't believe that entirely, but she believed he meant it. The second shift of 6 men arrived and she fed them the same way. They were less reserved than the first group. They'd heard something coming off the first shift, the particular murmur of men who want to recommend something without admitting they're enthusiastic about food. By the time the last plate was out, she had 3 separate requests for the recipe, which she declined politely, and one man from somewhere in Montana who said it was the best hash he'd eaten since he couldn't remember when. When they left, the kitchen was quiet in the way it gets after a lot of people have been in a small space. The particular silence of used air and scraped plates. May was washing up. Eliza leaned against the counter. That worked, May said. It did. Are you going to tell me what happened with the flour? Eliza looked at her. May was 14, but she was the least naive 14-year-old Eliza had met. She had the awareness of someone who'd grown up in a small town where information moved through adult conversations she wasn't supposed to be listening to and had listened to anyway. Someone bought it before I could, Eliza said. All of it. May was quiet, wringing out the cloth. Mr. Vale? Eliza said nothing, which was enough. May nodded slowly and went back to the dishes. The flour problem was not, as it turned out, a one-time event. She found out the full shape of it over the following 4 days. Marcus had not merely bought Hobart's stock. He had gone to the dry goods store, the other supply point in Dust Hollow, and spoken to the man who ran it, a taciturn individual named Chet, who had even fewer principles than he had words, and had made arrangements there as well. He'd also, through a business contact in the freighting operation that supplied Dust Hollow, requested advance notice of flour shipments and first right purchase on incoming stock. It was systematic. It was expensive. He'd spent more than the flour was worth to any practical purpose, which told her something about how much her continued existence in Dust Hollow's commercial life bothered him. And it was, she had to admit, well conceived. A kitchen that couldn't make bread couldn't serve the meals that had built her reputation. The biscuits, the pie, the cornbread. These were what people talked about on the freight roads. Take those away, and you had a woman selling hash and beans, which was fine, but not exceptional, not the kind of thing that made travelers cross miles of frozen road. She sat with this information for a full day before she did anything with it. The temptation was to panic, or to strategize desperately, or to find a way to escalate, go to the council again, or write to someone, or find a legal lever. She thought about all of those. She thought about going to Clara, who knew every working mechanism of Dust Hollow's social structure and might see an angle she couldn't. Instead, she went to Elias. She found him at his forge in the early evening, working on something she couldn't identify, a curved piece of iron that had no obvious purpose yet. She'd learned that with Elias, you let him finish what he was doing before you started talking. She stood near the doorway and waited. He set the piece down and looked at her. Vale's cornered the flour supply, she said. He nodded. He'd heard something, she could tell. I need to know if there's a way to get flour from outside Dust Hollow. A mill, a larger supplier in another town who'd deal directly with me. He thought about this for a moment. There's a Mennonite settlement about 18 miles east, he said. They mill their own grain, sell to travelers sometimes. I don't know if they do a regular arrangement. Do you know anyone there? I've done repair work for a man named Brenner. He came through last year with a broken spoke. Would he talk to me? I can write him. He paused. Take a few days. Mail's slow. I know. She looked at the curved piece of iron on his work table. What's that going to be? He looked at it. Hook. For someone's barn. He looked back at her. You're not going to wait, though. No. What are you going to do in the meantime? Cook without flour, she said. What followed was 2 weeks that changed how she thought about her own cooking in ways she wouldn't fully understand until later. With no wheat flour available, she worked with what she had, cornmeal, oats she'd bought in bulk before winter, dried hominy, and a small supply of rye she found at the back of Hobart's shelf. A product he carried but rarely sold, which Marcus had apparently not thought to claim. She bought all of it, every last pound of the rye. Rye was not forgiving. It didn't behave like wheat flour, and it punished cooks who treated it as though it did. Her first batch of rye biscuits came out so dense she could have used them to repair a road. She ate one standing at the counter, chewing through it with the expression of someone receiving information they'd rather not have. She adjusted. She added more lard, more liquid, worked the dough shorter. The second batch was better. The third was something she could actually serve without embarrassment. She developed a corn and rye bread that was dense and slightly sour and completely unlike anything she'd made before. The first time she served it, a man asked what it was. She told him. He ate 2 slices and asked for a third. She began to understand that the constraint was teaching her something. Working with what you had, actually working with it rather than substituting and wishing it were something else, produced results that were sometimes worse than what you'd planned and sometimes entirely different in a way that turned out to be better. She served cornmeal porridge with cured pork and a fried egg to a woman who'd been eating at the hotel and came to Eliza's kitchen out of curiosity. The woman ate it and said, "This isn't what I expected." "Is that good or bad?" Eliza asked. The woman considered. "Good," she said. "I think." The letter to Brenner came back in 8 days, which was faster than Elias had expected. He brought it to the kitchen one morning, which meant he'd been to the post office on her behalf, which was the kind of thing he did without mentioning it, and would have deflected any thanks about with considerable efficiency. She opened it at the counter while May pretended not to be paying attention and failed completely. Brenner wrote plainly. He could supply 50 pounds of flour per month at a fair price, loaded on his son's wagon, which came through the freight road near Dust Hollow every 3 weeks. He'd need payment in advance for the first order, which he specified was not personal, but policy for new arrangements, and he'd need someone to meet the wagon at the junction 4 miles east of town. She read the letter twice. She calculated the price against what she had. It was workable, barely, in the first month, more comfortably after that. She wrote back that afternoon and said yes to all of it. When the arrangement was sealed, she felt something she made a point not to celebrate too openly. Not because she was superstitious, but because she'd learned that visible relief was the same as visible weakness. And there were still people in Dust Hollow who reported her expressions back to Marcus Vale. She knew this because May had once mentioned casually that Hobart sometimes talked with one of Vale's hotel staff, and that some of what he said had a way of traveling. Small town, small channels, same water moving through all of them. She kept her face neutral and went back to work. Well, Marcus Vale found out about the Mennonite arrangement within 10 days. She didn't know exactly how, probably through the same channels everything else traveled, but she knew he'd found out because of what happened next. He came to see her. This was the first time he'd spoken to her directly since the day he'd handed her the rusted key. She was at the counter on a Thursday afternoon, after the midday service, doing her weekly accounting, a habit she'd developed of writing down every expenditure and every receipt in a small ledger she kept wrapped in oilcloth. When the door opened, she heard it and didn't look up immediately, because May often came in and out without knocking, and she'd learned to register footsteps before committing to a response. But these footsteps weren't May's. They were heavier and deliberate, and they stopped just inside the door. She looked up. Marcus Vale stood in her kitchen. He looked around it the way he had looked at her on the first day, assessing, categorizing, deciding what value to assign. But something had changed in his assessment process, and she could see it in the set of his shoulders. He was a man who'd expected a siege to be over by now. She set down her pencil. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Miss Harper." He looked at the shelf, the stove, the green oilcloth on the table. He looked at the tin on the table that still had the dried grasses in it, brown and brittle now in January, but still holding their shape. He looked at her ledger. "You've done something with this place." "I have." He moved to the center of the room. He didn't sit down, neither did she. "I want to make you an offer," he said. She waited. "I'll buy your lease from you, fair price. More than you paid, more than the kitchen's worth by any objective measure." He named a figure. It was generous, more generous than she'd expected, which told her something about how much he wanted the problem resolved. "You take that money, and you start over somewhere else. Fresh start. Better town, maybe, with more opportunity." She looked at him. He had the polished delivery of a man who'd made business propositions before and knew how to make them sound like favors. He was watching her the way he'd watched her on the first day, but with the calculation closer to the surface now. Less amusement, more attention. "You've put a lot of effort into driving me out," she said. "The license, the flour." His expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're—" "Mr. Vale," her voice was even. "We both know what I'm talking about. You don't need to perform innocence for my benefit, and I don't have time for it." Something shifted in his face. Not anger, more like a man who's been playing a game and has just had his hand called and is deciding whether to bluff or fold. He chose a third option, which was to simply not respond to that particular thing at all. "My offer stands," he said. "It's a good one." "I know it's a good one," she said. He waited. "No," she said. The words sat between them, small, absolute. He studied her. She held his gaze without hostility. She found that hostility was something that men like Vale absorbed and redirected, while steadiness confused them, because they had no category for a person who didn't want to fight but also couldn't be moved. "You understand," he said, "that I can make this harder for you." "You've already made it quite hard," she said. "I'm still here." He looked at her for a long moment. She watched the calculation move through his face, the various options being considered and discarded. I was a man accustomed to being the end of conversations, not the middle. He didn't know what to do with someone who listened to his best offer and said no without visible distress. "Think about it," he said finally. "I have," she said. "The answer's no." He left. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his footsteps cross the frozen ground outside, diminishing toward the hotel. Then she sat down, picked up her pencil, and went back to her ledger. Her hand was not entirely steady. She noticed this, held the pencil still for a moment until it was, and then continued writing. What Marcus did next was the most direct thing he'd done yet, and it came without warning on a Friday morning. He contacted the 12 workers she was scheduled to feed that day, the road crew, back for another stretch of repair work north of town, and told their foreman, through an intermediary, that the hotel was offering a significantly reduced rate for a group lunch arrangement. The hotel. Full service. Table and chairs and Pete's cooking, which was adequate if uninspired, and the institutional respectability of an actual hotel dining room versus a woman's kitchen behind a freight barn. Garrett, the foreman, was a practical man. Reduced rate was reduced rate. He sent a boy to let Eliza know, an hour before the crew was supposed to arrive. The boy was about 10, embarrassed by his errand in the way children are when they've been asked to deliver bad news to adults. He stood at her door and told her the arrangement had changed and the men would be eating at the hotel. She thanked him. She gave him a biscuit. She had flour again, Brenner's first delivery having arrived the previous week. And he left. She stood in the kitchen. She had prepared for 12. She had a pot of beans, 2 loaves of bread, a pan of roasted potatoes, a quantity of salt pork, and 2 pies. A full service for 12 men, representing a significant investment in ingredients that she'd bought on the expectation of 12 paid meals. May arrived at her usual time and took in the situation quickly. "The crew's not coming," May said. "No." "What do we do with all this?" Eliza looked at the food. She looked at the door. Then she made a decision that was not, strictly speaking, rational from a financial standpoint. "Help me carry it," she said. There was a boarding house on the south edge of Dust Hollow, run by a widow named Mrs. Pell, who took in laborers and travelers at rates lower than the hotel, and fed them on a thin margin that had gotten thinner as winter wore on. Mrs. Pell had 2 boarders currently who were out of work. A man who'd come hoping for mine work that hadn't materialized and was waiting for spring, and an older man who did odd jobs around town and was between jobs. There were also 3 children in the boarding house, Mrs. Pell's own, ranging from 6 to 12, who ate what the margin allowed. Eliza and May carried the food to Mrs. Pell's house in 3 trips, which took 40 minutes in the cold. Mrs. Pell opened the door and looked at what they were carrying. "What is this?" she said. "Lunch," Eliza said. "My arrangement fell through. I'd rather feed people than throw it away." Mrs. Pell looked at her with the complicated expression Eliza had come to recognize, the one that moved through suspicion and pride and reluctant gratitude in about 4 seconds. "I can't pay you for this," Mrs. Pell said. "I didn't ask you to." They brought the food in. Mrs. Pell fed her boarders and her children and herself, and there was enough left over for dinner. The man who'd been waiting for mine work, a quiet, large man named Tom, who had the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been out of work long enough to start doubting himself, ate 2 full plates and then sat very still for a while, the way people do when they've been hungrier than they'd been willing to admit. He looked at Eliza. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. She meant it simply. That was all it was. She'd made food. She didn't want it wasted. It was better to give it than to throw it. But she noticed something on his face when she said it. A small thing, a slight easing, and she thought about what Sully had said. Small things are what make a place. She walked back to the kitchen in the January cold with May beside her, their breath making white clouds. "We lost 12 paid meals," May said. "Yes." "That's a lot." "It is." May was quiet for a moment. "But you're not upset about it." Eliza considered this. "I'm upset about Vale," she said. "I'm not upset about Mrs. Pell." Tom, The man at the boarding house found work the following week. Odd jobs mostly, but steady, and he ate at Eliza's kitchen 3 times that month. He told people why. He was not an eloquent man, and he didn't tell it in a way that made for a compelling story, exactly, but he told it accurately, which was enough. A thing began to happen in Dust Hollow that Eliza was only partially aware of while it was happening. She became, in the minds of the town's residents, the ones who lived there year-round and watched things develop slowly rather than passing through and getting a single impression, something different from what they'd expected. She was not the woman who'd been handed a ruin and miraculously succeeded. She was something more complicated than that. A woman who'd been handed a ruin and had worked specifically and unglamorously day by day, making decisions that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong and adjusting when they were wrong, and who had not collapsed when things got bad and had not crowed when things went well. That was a harder thing to dismiss than a simple success story. Success stories could be attributed to luck, to special talent, to circumstances. What Eliza had done was too consistent, too methodical, to be attributed to luck. Clara put it plainly one Thursday afternoon, at the table with her pie and her coffee, looking at Eliza with the particular directness that she reserved for assessments she considered important. "He's not going to stop," Clara said, "but he's running out of moves that work." "What's left?" Eliza asked. "I don't know." Clara ate her pie. "That's what concerns me. Men like Marcus Vale, when the smart moves don't work, they go to cruder ones." "What does crude look like?" "Could be anything. Could be something to the building. Claiming a safety issue. Finding a structural problem that requires inspection. Could be social. Convincing someone you respect to pressure you. Could be personal." She paused. "How well do you know your own history? Is there anything he could find that you'd rather he didn't?" Eliza thought about this honestly, the way you have to when someone asks a question that deserves a real answer. "Nothing dramatic," she said. "I left home under difficult circumstances. My family and I didn't part well." "What kind of difficult?" "The kind where they thought less of me than they should have and said so. Nothing criminal, nothing that would hold up as a scandal." She looked at her hands on the table. "Just ordinary failures. The kind that happen when you're not the person your family hoped you'd be." Clara nodded. "That's probably not useful to him then." "Probably not." Clara finished her pie. She looked at the tin with the dried grasses, which Eliza still hadn't replaced even though they were well past any useful decorative function. She looked at the shelf, which was now orderly and full. She looked at the green oilcloth. "You've made this a decent place," she said. "It was always a decent place," Eliza said. "It just needed someone to stay in it long enough." Well, the thing Marcus Vale finally tried, the crude move Clara had predicted, came on a Thursday at the end of January, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp at the back of your throat. He went to Alderman Greer. This time, not about licensing. This time, about the building itself. He had someone, she never found out who, though she had suspicions, file a complaint stating that the kitchen structure was potentially unsafe, that the stove installation was improper, that the flue presented a fire hazard to the adjacent freight barn, and that the matter required immediate inspection by the council. The inspection was scheduled for the following Monday. Eliza found out on Friday afternoon, 30 minutes before she would have closed for the day, when Greer himself came to the door. He had the look of a man doing someone else's errand and not entirely comfortable about it. He handed her the notice. She read it. She looked up at him. "Who filed the complaint?" she asked. "Complaints are anonymous," he said. Of course they are." She folded the notice. "I understand the stove installation needs to be up to standard." "That's correct." "Who conducts the inspection?" "Council sends a designee, usually someone with construction or trade knowledge." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said, "Monday morning." After he left, she stood in the kitchen and looked at the stove. Elias had installed it. Elias knew ironwork and heating systems better than anyone within 50 miles of Dust Hollow. The installation was correct because Elias didn't do incorrect work. It wasn't in his nature, the same way it wasn't in his nature to say more than he meant or charge more than things cost. But correct and officially certified were two different things, and she didn't know who the council's designee would be or what that person's relationship with Marcus Vale looked like. She went to Elias that evening. He listened to the situation without interrupting. When she was done, He was quiet for a moment in his usual way. "The installation is sound," he said. "I know that." "I'll come Monday," he said. "I'll be there when they inspect. If anyone says the installation is wrong, they're saying it to me directly." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He picked up the curved piece of iron, the hook for someone's barn, and set it in the correct position to examine the angle. "She draws right, temperature holds, the flue is clear." He set it down. "Anyone who says otherwise is lying, and I'll say so." She nodded. She walked back to the kitchen in the dark and stood at the stove with her hand near the surface, feeling the heat it held even hours after the last fire. Elias had built a proper firebox seal. The flue had been cleaned in November and drawn cleanly since. The left burner plate he'd cast was solid and had been solid for 3 months. She thought about Marcus Vale sitting in his hotel, running out of moves that worked and not willing to accept it. She thought about the amount of money and effort he'd spent on a woman he'd expected to leave in the first 2 weeks. She thought for the first time that there was something almost sad about it. Not in a way that made her sympathetic, not yet, but in the way that a locked room is sad, where the person inside has forgotten there's a door. She stoked the fire one more time, banked it for the night, and went to bed. Monday would be Monday. She had food to make before then. What? The inspector arrived at 9 in the morning. He was a man Eliza hadn't seen before, brought in from somewhere outside Dust Hollow, which told her the council had at least enough sense to know that using a local designee would look problematic. His name was Calloway, and he had the manner of a man who took measurements seriously and had been doing this long enough to find other people's urgency tedious. Elias was already there when Calloway arrived. He was sitting on the bench near the door with his hat on his knee, doing nothing, which was a posture that somehow managed to communicate both complete relaxation and complete readiness. Calloway inspected the stove. He inspected the flue connection. He checked the firebox seal. He looked at the distance between the stove and the wooden wall, which met the required clearance. He checked the floor around the stove base. He wrote in his notebook. He looked at Elias. "You did this installation?" Calloway asked. "I did," Elias said. "It's clean work." "Yes," Elias said, without inflection. Calloway made another note. He closed his notebook. He looked at Eliza. "I'll file my report with the council today," he said. "I don't anticipate any issues." After he left, Eliza stood in the middle of the kitchen. Elias was still on the bench. May was washing the breakfast dishes. "That's it?" May said. "That's it," Eliza said. She felt the relief move through her and let it, because she was alone with people she trusted and she didn't have to manage her face. Elias stood up and put his hat on. He looked at the stove one more time, a professional's last look at a job he'd done right. "I'll be at the shop," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left. May dried her hands on a cloth and turned around. "So he's lost again," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. May thought about this. What does he do now? It was the same question Clara had asked, in different words, and Eliza still didn't have a clean answer. She knew Marcus Vale hadn't accepted the shape of things yet. She knew that losing 3 times to the same person had likely moved something in him from calculation into something less rational. She also knew something she hadn't known in October, hadn't known in November, hadn't known even a month ago. She was not going to leave. Not because leaving was unthinkable, not because she'd won, but because she had built something that was genuinely hers. Hers in the way that things only become yours when you've repaired them and suffered for them and refused to give them up when someone decided they wanted you gone. The kitchen smelled like bread and coffee and the particular warmth of a stove that had been running all morning. She had work to do. She put on her apron, rolled up her sleeves, and went back to the stove. Calloway's report cleared the kitchen inside of 48 hours. Eliza knew because Greer sent a boy with a note, brief, administrative, carrying the particular dryness of official language being used to communicate that nothing was wrong and implying, in its very brevity, that the matter ought not to have been raised in the first place. She read it, folded it, placed it with the license receipt and the original notice in the oilcloth envelope she kept at the back of the shelf. She had 4 documents in that envelope now. She thought of them the way you think of scars. Not fondly exactly, but with a certain respect for what they represented. She'd earned each one by surviving what produced it. February came. The cold deepened in the way Wyoming cold does in its second month. Not dramatically, but with a settled permanence that made you understand it wasn't going anywhere soon and you'd better arrange your life accordingly. Eliza added an extra layer of insulation to the window shutter, stuffing rags into the gap between the wood and the frame. She kept the stove running longer into the night than she had in January, which cost more in wood but was the difference between a kitchen that was merely cold at dawn and one that was genuinely hostile to existence. She was making money now. Not a significant amount by any standard that Marcus Vale would recognize, but more than she spent, which was the fundamental arithmetic she cared about. Brenner's flour came reliably on its 3-week cycle. Ruth's arrangement with the mining camps was generating steady income. Her breakfast and midday service ran consistently at 10 to 15 customers, more on days when the freight road was busy. She had also, without entirely planning to, become something like a fixed point in Dust Hollow's daily life. Not the most important one, the hotel held that position by virtue of its size, and Marcus Vale's 20 years of investment in being indispensable. 1. People organized small things around her kitchen. The barber's wife and 2 other women had taken to meeting there on Wednesday afternoons. A group of freighters who ran the same northern route had started timing their stops to coincide with her midday service. The man named Tom, who'd found his odd jobs and kept them, ate breakfast with her 3 times a week with the regularity of someone who'd decided a place was worth returning to and didn't see any reason to pretend otherwise. Marcus Vale had gone quiet. This was the thing that occupied a portion of Eliza's attention even when she was doing other things. The particular silence from the hotel that had replaced the sequence of moves he'd been making. She didn't trust it. Clara had told her not to trust it, and Clara's reading of Dust Hollow's social atmosphere had been accurate enough times that Eliza took it seriously. But 3 weeks of silence after the inspection report had a quality to it that she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't the silence of a man planning his next move. It felt more like the silence of a man sitting with something. She didn't know what to do with that distinction, so she did what she always did when she couldn't resolve something. She worked and waited and paid attention. The first sign that something had shifted came from an unexpected direction. Pete, the hotel's cook, the man whose technically competent and motivationally deficient cooking had driven people to Eliza's kitchen in the first place, came to her door on a Wednesday morning in the 2nd week of February. He was a man of about 40, thick-set, with the look of someone who'd been doing the same job in the same place long enough that the job had started to shape him physically, like water shaping stone. She'd seen him around town, but they'd never spoken. There was an obvious awkwardness in standing here. A man employed by the person who'd spent months trying to destroy her, standing at her door, which he'd clearly knocked on only after some private argument with himself about whether to do it at all. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back and let him. He stood just inside the door and looked at the kitchen the way people look at a place they've heard about but not seen. His professional eye moved over the stove, the counter arrangement, the shelf. He was cataloging it the way a cook catalogs another cook's setup, assessing capability, noting what was there and what wasn't. "You've done well in here," he said. "What can I do for you, Pete?" He turned to look at her. He had the expression of a man deciding whether to say the actual thing he'd come to say or a safer version of it. He chose the actual thing, which she respected. "I wanted to tell you that what happened with the flour, I didn't know about it until it was done. And what happened with your road crew?" He stopped. I'm not comfortable with those things. I work for the man and I cook his meals, and that's my business. But I'm not his instrument for that kind of work." She looked at him steadily. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you I didn't have a part in it." He shifted his weight. "And I'm telling you that if you ever need to know what's being discussed at the hotel, not anything private, not conversation that isn't mine to share, but if there's something you'd want to know that I can tell you honestly, I will." It was a careful offer, carefully bounded, carefully qualified. He wasn't offering to be a spy. He was offering to be something closer to a warning system, within limits he'd set himself. She thought about it. "I appreciate that," she said, "and I appreciate you coming to say this." He nodded. He looked around the kitchen once more, that professional assessment. "Your biscuits," he said. "People talk about them more than they talk about anything I've ever made. I've been cooking for 17 years. She didn't know what to say to that. "They're my mother's recipe," she said finally. "I've adjusted it, but it's mostly hers." He nodded again, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Some things you can't learn," he said. You either got them from someone who had them, or you didn't.
He left. She stood in the kitchen after he'd gone and thought about what he'd said, not the information about Marcus. That mattered, but was secondary. The other part. Some things you can't learn. It was meant as a compliment, and she'd taken it as one, but it also made her think about her mother in the way she didn't always let herself, fully, without the protective distance she usually kept around that particular grief. Her mother's hands on the counter, the specific way she'd cut lard into flour, quickly, without overthinking it. The sound the biscuit cutter made on the board.
She'd learned it by watching before she was old enough to do it herself. And then she'd done it wrong for years before she'd done it right. And her mother had let her do it wrong and corrected her without drama. And eventually it had become her own thing. Not exactly what her mother did, but descended from it, the way a child resembles a parent without being the parent. That was the inheritance. Not money, not land. Away with a biscuit cutter. She pushed herself off the counter and started on the day's bread. What Pete had essentially told her, that he'd be honest with her if honesty was possible, turned out to matter sooner than she'd expected. He came by again 9 days later, on a Thursday, just before her midday service. He didn't come inside. He stood at the door and said quietly that he'd overheard something the previous evening that he thought she should know. Marcus Vale had written a letter. Pete didn't know who it was he'd seen it being sealed, not written, and the address on the envelope had been turned face down before he could read it. But the letter had been given to a rider heading south, toward Cheyenne, and Marcus had mentioned to his hotel manager, in the casual way of a man who doesn't expect his staff to be paying close attention, that he expected a response within 2 weeks. He seemed settled when he said it, Pete told her. Not angry, not the way he's been. He paused. Satisfied. Like a man who's found the right tool for a job. She thanked him, and he left, and she stood at her counter and thought about a letter going south to Cheyenne and what kinds of people in Cheyenne a man like Marcus Vale would write to when everything else had failed. Lawyers, officials, people with institutional leverage she didn't have access to. Or, and this possibility was colder, someone who'd known her before Dust Hollow. Someone from her past who could speak to her character, or lack thereof, in ways that would be more damaging than a rat rumor or a licensing complaint. She thought about what she'd told Clara, the kind where they thought less of me than they should have and said so. Her family. 3 brothers, a father, a mother who'd loved her in the specific and insufficient way of a woman who'd wanted a different kind of daughter. They hadn't been cruel exactly. They'd been disappointed, consistently, in ways that accumulated. When she'd left, her father had said something she'd carried west with her like a stone in her pocket, heavy enough that she knew it was there, too familiar to be surprised by. He'd said, "You'll come back. There's nothing out there for a woman like you." He hadn't meant it viciously. He'd meant it the way people mean things when they've already decided what's true and are just reporting their findings. She'd spent 4 months proving him wrong. She couldn't prove anything to whatever Marcus Vale's letter was going to produce. She didn't know what form it would take. She decided to make pie. This was not avoidance. This was the thing she'd learned about herself over the preceding months. That the time when her hands needed most to be busy was the time when her mind was working on something it couldn't resolve yet. And the best thing for both the thinking and the working was to let them happen simultaneously. The pie required attention, but not all of her attention, and the part of her that wasn't tracking crust consistency and filling temperature was moving through the problem of Marcus Vale's letter from several angles at once. By the time the pie was in the stove, she'd arrived at something that felt like a position, if not a plan. She couldn't control what he'd written or who would receive it. She couldn't intercept a reply. She couldn't prepare a defense against a threat whose specific shape she didn't know. What she could do was make sure that the 2 weeks before the reply arrived were spent building things rather than protecting things. More customers, stronger relationships, more of the kind of reputation Clara had described, the kind that traveled and arrived in a place before any letter did. She also did something she'd been putting off because it felt premature, or presumptuous, or like a claim she wasn't sure she'd earned yet. She made a sign. What? She asked Elias to make it. She'd thought about what she wanted carefully. Not fancy, nothing that would look like pretension on a freight barn kitchen. A piece of wood, painted, mounted above the door. Her name and what she did. Simple as that. Elias made it in 2 days and mounted it himself on a Saturday morning while she was doing service. He came in when he was done and told her it was up. She went out and looked at it. Eliza Harper. Meals.
That was all. Black paint on a planed board, the letters even and legible. She stood in the February cold and looked at her name above her door. May came out and stood beside her. "It looks real," May said. "It is real," Eliza said. "I mean, it looks like it's always been there." Eliza looked at her own name for another moment. She'd looked at it on official documents her whole life, on school records, on the notice Greer had given her, on her own handwriting in her ledger. But this was different. This was the building wearing her name like a fact. She went back inside and finished service. Mug.
On the 12th day after Pete's warning about the letter, Eliza was in the middle of her morning prep when Clara arrived, earlier than her usual Thursday afternoon visit, which was notable because Clara was a woman of fixed habits and deviating from them required cause. She sat down without taking off her coat. "Marcus received a reply yesterday," Clara said. Eliza kept moving. "What kind of reply?" "I don't know the content, but I know his response to it." She paused. "He wasn't satisfied." Eliza looked up. "He called his manager into his office last night, and they were in there for 2 hours," Clara said. "My husband's cousin boards at the hotel. He heard raised voices. Vale's, not the manager's." She folded her hands on the table. Whatever he hoped the letter would produce, it didn't produce it. Eliza set down what she was holding and stood very still. "Do you know who he wrote to?" she asked. "Not for certain." Clara met her eyes. "But given the direction and the timing, and given what I know about Marcus Vale's history in this territory, I think he wrote to a land solicitor in Cheyenne, someone who might find a problem with the building's original title. The freight barn's ownership has changed hands several times. If the kitchen structure wasn't properly included in any of those transfers," she stopped, "it would be the kind of thing that could take a building out from under someone." The air in the kitchen felt different for a moment, thinner. "And the reply?" Eliza asked. "Apparently the title is clean," Clara said, "or clean enough that whoever he consulted told him it wasn't worth pursuing." She looked at Eliza carefully. "He's out of moves, Eliza." She should have felt relief. She felt something more complicated, the precarious sensation of standing on ground that was solid but that you'd just learned had crevices in it you hadn't known about. The title had been fine this time. That he'd looked was something she'd have to carry with her. "He'll find something," Eliza said. "Maybe," Clara said, "or maybe he'll accept it." She paused. "Men like Vale, they don't always accept things gracefully, but they do eventually accept them. When the cost of not accepting becomes too high." What does that mean in practical terms? It means every time he spends money or political capital trying to remove you and fails, he loses something. Not just the money, the credibility. People in this town watch him not be able to manage one woman in a kitchen behind his freight barn, and they draw conclusions. Clara picked up her coffee cup, which Eliza had poured without thinking during the conversation. "You've been costing him more than money for months. You've been costing him the story he tells about himself." She thought about that all through February and into early March, the story a man tells about himself. Marcus Vale's story was that he was the essential figure in Dust Hollow, the one whose presence or absence determined whether things flourished or failed. The hotel was the physical expression of that story. His dining room was where Dust Hollow's commerce happened, where deals were made, where the town's merchants and officials gathered. Except they were gathering at a kitchen behind the freight barn increasingly often now, and the story was developing holes. She didn't think about this with satisfaction. She thought about it the way you think about a structural problem in a building, practically, without emotion. A man whose story about himself was failing could become unpredictable. Clara had said as much. And unpredictable was harder to prepare for than strategic. She started paying more attention. She noticed that Marcus Vale had reduced his public presence in town. He appeared less at the general store, less at the post office. He still ran the hotel. It was his livelihood as much as his identity, but he was doing it with less of the visible authority he'd carried when she arrived. Fewer pronouncements in the street. Fewer gatherings of the town's merchant class at his dining room table, which she heard about secondhand through May's extraordinary social intelligence. Pete came by once more, in early March, not with information but simply, she sensed, because he'd gotten into the habit, and the habit had become something he needed without quite being able to justify why. "How is he?" she asked. Pete understood who she meant. He thought about it. "Quieter," he said. He used to fill a room when he walked into it. He doesn't do that as much lately. She nodded. Is he ill? She asked. Not that I can see. Pete looked at the stove. He's eating less, maybe. I noticed that. Who eats what? How much? Occupational thing. He paused. He sits alone more. She filed this away. March came in with mud. The particular mud of a Wyoming thaw, which is different from the mud of places that thaw gradually. Here it happened in stages, the ground refusing and then conceding, and the result was a week of conditions that made the freight roads challenging and travel uncomfortable, and her kitchen busier than it had been all winter, because people who'd been moving carefully for months finally started moving, and they came through Dust Hollow, cold and tired and hungry. She hired a second helper. This was not a decision she made easily. She'd watched her finances with the particular vigilance of someone who'd been poor enough that the memory of 40 cents in her pocket was still tactile. But she needed someone who could manage the morning water and wood while May handled service, because she couldn't be at the stove and at the door simultaneously when there were 12 people in a room built for 6. The person she hired was Mrs. Pell's oldest child, the 12-year-old, a girl named Abigail, who'd watched Eliza carry food to the boarding house in January with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and calculation. She was a quiet, capable child who reminded Eliza somewhat of herself at that age, which made her simultaneously easier and harder to manage. Abigail's first week was rough in the specific way that a smart person's first week at a new job is rough. She understood things quickly and then was frustrated when understanding didn't immediately translate into smooth execution. She knocked over a pot of water on the second day and spent the subsequent 10 minutes being disproportionately upset about it. It's water, Eliza told her. It was supposed to be for the coffee. There's more water. Clean it up and get more. Abigail looked at her. You're not angry? I'm not angry about spilled water. She handed the girl a cloth. I'd be angry if you spilled it and then stood there looking at it instead of fixing it. Abigail cleaned it up and got more water and didn't knock anything over again, which was less because she was more careful and more because the anxiety around perfection eased once she knew the consequence for imperfection was a cloth and not a scene. Eliza recognized this because she'd lived it. The letter that arrived in mid-March was not from Cheyenne. It was from her mother. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she saw the return address. Her mother's particular way of writing capital letters, the E of Eliza slightly larger than it needed to be, as though her mother had made the E with something specific in mind, and then continued with the name almost as an afterthought. She stood at the kitchen counter with the letter in her hand for a while before she opened it. Her mother wrote carefully, the way she did everything carefully, not without feeling, but with feeling managed, organized into sentences that said what they meant without extravagance. She said she'd heard, through a cousin who had a contact who ran freight through Wyoming, that Eliza was doing well. She said the family was in reasonable health. She said her father's hip had been troubling him since October. She said, and this was the part that sat in Eliza's chest with unexpected weight, that she hoped Eliza was warm enough out there, that she'd been worried about the winters. It was a small letter, a letter from a woman who had not always been adequate to the task of loving her daughter in ways her daughter could feel, trying, in her late way, to close some of the distance. Eliza read it twice. She wrote back that evening, a short letter, not cold but not warm enough to pretend the distance hadn't existed. She said she was well. She said the kitchen was running. She said the winters were cold, but she had a good stove. She did not say she missed her. She was not entirely sure it was true. And she'd spent enough of her life not being entirely sure of her own feelings to have learned that putting uncertain feelings into writing created more problems than it solved. She sent the letter. She went back to work. It was May who first said it out loud. She came in one morning in the third week of March with the specific energy of someone carrying news they've been sitting on and can no longer contain. And she set down the water bucket and said, without preamble, Mr. Vale is sick. Eliza looked up from the counter. What kind of sick? Properly sick, May said. The doctor came twice yesterday. Mrs. Greer told my mother. She felt something move through her that she didn't have an immediate name for. It wasn't satisfaction. She was certain of that. It wasn't quite concern either. Not yet. It was more like the sensation of a story shifting, the ground underneath a narrative that had seemed stable developing a new angle. How sick? She asked. I don't know exactly. Something with his chest, maybe. He hasn't come out of the hotel in 3 days. She nodded and went back to what she was doing. But her mind was on Marcus Vale lying in a room in his hotel. A room she'd never seen, in a building she'd never entered since the day he'd handed her the rusted key. She thought about Pete cooking meals that a sick man might not be eating. She thought about Clara's observation, that wealth couldn't buy a story that was working, and couldn't buy the genuine regard of people who saw through to what was underneath. She thought about who was visiting him, and she thought about the answer, which she suspected was close to nobody. She found out more over the following days through the ordinary channels. May's social network, Clara's sharper intelligence, a comment from Hobart, who'd heard from someone who'd heard from someone. Marcus Vale had a chest illness that the doctor was treating with the limited toolkit frontier medicine provided. He was not in immediate mortal danger, apparently, but he was genuinely unwell, the kind of unwell that kept a man in bed and left him with too much time to think. No family came. She'd known, in the abstract way you know things about people in small towns, that Marcus Vale had no family nearby. He'd come to Dust Hollow from somewhere back east, Ohio, she thought she'd heard once, and he'd built his hotel and his position and his story about himself without family to witness it or share it, which was a choice some people made and which had its own particular cost that usually didn't come due until exactly this kind of moment. People from town stopped by the hotel occasionally. Alderman Greer, the dry goods man Chet, a couple of the merchants who'd had long relationships with him. But these were business visits, formal calls, the kind made out of social obligation rather than genuine concern. She heard nothing that sounded like actual friendship walking through that hotel door. She thought about it for 4 days. Then she made soup. This was not a simple decision. She thought about it from multiple angles because she was not someone who acted from pure impulse without examining what the impulse was attached to. Was this pity? Partially, maybe. Was it strategy? A gesture that would look magnanimous and further erode his position? She couldn't say there was none of that in it. Was it something older and more basic, the thing her mother had demonstrated without ever naming it? That you fed people who needed feeding, regardless of the history, because food was not a prize you awarded to people who deserved it, but a thing you gave because giving it was right? Yes, mostly that. She made a bone broth, long and slow, from a joint she'd been saving for a different purpose. She added onions, herbs from the dried bundle she still had from Dora Fitch's daughter, a small amount of salt and the careful touch she gave to anything she made for someone who wasn't well. She made it a simple bread to go alongside. Not the corn and rye from the flour shortage, but a proper wheat loaf from Brenner's Flour, soft enough to eat without effort. She packed it carefully. She put on her coat. May was watching her. "I'm taking this to the hotel," Eliza said. May was quiet for a moment. "To Mr. Vale?" "Yes." May said nothing else. She had the wisdom, at 14, to understand that some things weren't hers to comment on. The hotel was warm in the way of places that had money for wood and had never had to count it. She stood at the front desk and told the manager, a thin young man who looked at her with the expression of someone who was very confused about what was happening, that she'd brought food for Mr. Vale and would like it delivered to his room. The manager stared at the covered pot she was holding. "You're—" He stopped. "Miss Harper." "Yes." "Mr. Vale isn't—" He seemed to be deciding something. "He's not receiving visitors." "I'm not a visitor. I'm delivering food." She set the pot on the counter and set the bread beside it. "It's broth. It's hot. You should have it while it's warm." The manager looked at the food. He looked at her. He had the particular helplessness of someone facing a situation that wasn't covered by any instruction he'd received. "I'll take it up myself if that's easier," she said. "No," the manager said. He picked up the pot carefully, as though it might do something unexpected. "I'll bring it." She turned to leave. "Miss Harper." She stopped. The manager was holding the pot and looking at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not unfriendly, not fully open, somewhere in between. "Why are you doing this?" She thought about the question. She thought about the various true answers and which one to give. "Because someone should," she said. She walked out into the March cold. What? She half expected nothing to come of it. She half expected Marcus Vale to have the food thrown away, or to send her a cold message about unwanted charity, or simply to never acknowledge it at all. What happened instead was that Pete came by the next morning with the empty pot. He set it on her counter without ceremony. He ate it, Pete said. Good. All of it. Pete looked at the pot. He asked who sent it. I wasn't there when the manager brought it up, so I don't know what he said. But he asked me about it this morning. He said, he stopped, reconsidering something. He said it was the best broth he'd had in a long time. She dried her hands on her apron. He wanted me to return the pot, Pete said. I noticed. Pete looked at her. You knew he'd send it back. I knew it was possible. He picked up his hat. You're a strange woman, Miss Harper. I'll take that, she said. After Pete left, she set the pot back in its place on the shelf and thought about a man alone in a hotel room eating broth that his enemy had made for him. She thought about what that felt like from the inside. Not the humility of it, which would take longer to arrive, but the immediate sensation of being fed by someone who had every reason not to feed you. She thought about what her mother had said in the letter. I hope you're warm enough out there. An inadequate expression of care, arriving late, not fully adequate to what it was trying to cover, but real. Genuine in its small, late, insufficient way. Maybe that was how it worked sometimes. Maybe the warmth arrived after the wound, and you had to decide whether to accept it anyway. Well, she sent soup a second time, 3 days later, because he was apparently still unwell, and because, having done it once, not doing it again felt like a statement she didn't mean to make. This time she added a small piece of apple cake, not pie, because pie required more work to transport, but the cake held its texture and traveled without damage. She sent it with May, who was less conspicuous than Eliza herself appearing at the hotel door again. May came back with the empty pot and with information. The manager said Mr. Vale asked him to tell you thank you, May said. Eliza looked at her. Those were his words? The manager's words were, Mr. Vale asked me to convey his gratitude. May paused. I think that's the same thing. It's close enough, Eliza said. She thought about Marcus Vale learning to say thank you for something his enemy had made him. She thought about what that cost a man like him. Not the admission of weakness exactly, but the acknowledgement of a debt to someone whose existence he'd spent months trying to erase. The two words passing through the manager as intermediary, arriving at Eliza secondhand, stripped of whatever tone they'd been said in. She chose to take them simply, as words that meant what they said. By the last week of March, Marcus Vale was well enough to come downstairs. She didn't see it happen. She heard about it from Clara, who had a view of the hotel entrance from her parlor window and had apparently been paying attention. He came down on a Wednesday afternoon and sat in the hotel lobby for an hour, according to Clara's report, and then went back upstairs. The following day he came down and sat in his own dining room for the first time in 2 weeks. Pete told her this, not as information she'd asked for, but as something he felt she should know. In the casual way he'd started sharing things that seemed relevant to what was happening between the two establishments. He looks different, Pete said. Different how? Pete thought about it. He was not a man who spoke loosely. Quieter. Not sick quiet. Just, he seemed to be working towards something. Like a man who's been alone with himself for a while and didn't entirely enjoy it. She understood that. She'd had her own version of it. The particular education of being forced to sit with yourself when there was nothing to distract you, when the work was stripped away and the strategy was irrelevant, and all that was left was who you were when you weren't doing anything in particular. Is he eating? She asked. Some. Pete paused. He asked me today if I knew what you'd put in the broth. She almost smiled. What did you say? I said I didn't, which is true. He looked at her. What did you put in it? Bones, she said. Thyme, salt. She paused. The same things you put in any broth. He nodded as if this confirmed something. I'll tell him that, he said. You can tell him whatever you like, she said. The visit came on a Saturday morning, a week into April, when the mud had dried enough that the freight road was running again, and Dust Hollow had the particular energy of a place waking up after a long winter. Not cheerful exactly, but purposeful, the way people are when the season has finally agreed to change, and there are things that can be done that couldn't be done before. Eliza was in the middle of service. 4 people at the table, 2 waiting, May carrying plates with the competent efficiency she'd developed over months. When the door opened and Marcus Vale walked in. He was thinner than he'd been. The illness had taken something off him that hadn't entirely come back yet.
He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which she'd never seen him do. The other time he'd visited, he'd been in full authority, standing in the center of the room, filling space by habit. Now he stood where the light came in from behind him and waited until she looked up. She looked up. The four people at the table went very quiet, in the way of people who understand that something is happening that they should not interrupt. "I wanted to come myself," he said, "to say thank you." She held his gaze. "You're welcome." He looked around the kitchen, the shelf, the stove, the green oilcloth, the tin with the dried grasses she'd never quite gotten around to replacing, the sign above the door that said her name. He looked at the people at the table who were trying to appear uninterested and failing. "Could I—" He stopped. It was the first time she'd seen him uncertain, not distressed, not humbled into performance, but genuinely uncertain, the way a man is when he's decided to do something and is only partway sure it was the right decision. "Could I sit down somewhere, briefly?" She gestured to the bench near the wall. Not the table, not among the other customers, but a separate place. He went and sat down. May appeared with coffee without being asked, which was the kind of initiative that had made May invaluable. He took the coffee. He held the cup. When the four customers finished and left, the kitchen was quiet enough that she could stand near the counter and have a conversation without performing for an audience. "The broth," he said. "My manager told me who sent it. I assumed he would. I didn't know what to do with that." He looked at the coffee cup. "I've spent—" He stopped, reconsidering. He tried again. "I've been unkind to you." She said nothing. It was not the kind of statement that needed her help. "I told myself it was business," he said. "That's what men like me tell themselves. It's business. It's competition. It's nothing personal." He looked up. The flower was personal. The license was personal. All of it was personal, and I'd like you to know I understand that now. She thought about what to say. She thought about several versions of the truth and which one applied to this particular man in this particular moment. "Why did you come here?" she asked. Not the kitchen. She meant Dust Hollow. Originally. He seemed surprised by the question. "I had money and I wanted to build something." "And did you?" "Yes." He looked around the room, at her room. "So did you." His voice was not generous exactly. It was honest, which was a harder thing. With considerably less. She picked up a cloth and wiped the counter, not because it needed wiping, but because her hands needed something to do. "The soup helped," he said. "I want you to know that, not just the food, the fact of it." He was struggling with the language in a way that she found unexpectedly human. "I'd been lying there for a week thinking about things. The kind of things you think when you've been working so hard at something for so long that you've forgotten to check whether it's still worth working at." He set the cup down. "And then someone sent soup. Someone I'd treated badly." He paused. It made me think." She nodded. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he said. He was clear about this in the way of a man who understood that clarity was the only thing he had to offer right now. "I'm not going to dress this up as some kind of transaction. I just wanted to come and say thank you in person and tell you that I'm done with what I was doing." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the freight road was moving. She could hear wagon wheels in the distance, the sound of March commerce resuming after winter. She looked at Marcus Vale sitting on her bench with his hat in his hands and his coffee cup on the table beside him, thinner than he'd been, quieter than he'd been, saying something that cost him more than any of the money he'd spent on licenses and flour and lawyers. "I appreciate you coming," she said. It was not forgiveness, fully. She wasn't sure forgiveness was the right word for what this moment was, and she'd learned enough about her own feelings to distrust quick answers. But it was something, the kind of something that might become more if the days that followed it were different from the days that had come before. He stood up. He put on his hat. At the door he paused and looked back. "Your sign," he said. She waited. "It suits the place," he said. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment, in the quiet after a long storm, feeling the particular stillness of a conflict that had not ended. Nothing as clean as an ending. But that had changed shape in a way that left room for something else to exist in the space it had occupied. May came back in with the empty coffee cup. She looked at Eliza. She looked at the door. "Well," she said. "Yes," Eliza said. She put her apron back on.
There was still an afternoon's work ahead of her, and people would be hungry, and the stove was hot, and the bread she'd put in an hour ago was nearly done. She went back to work. April in Wyoming does not arrive the way people from gentler climates expect it to. It does not come in soft and promising with warm breezes and early flowers. It comes in sideways, with cold mornings that argue against the calendar and afternoons that briefly relent before changing their minds overnight. The mud from the thaw stays for weeks. The freight road north of town developed a section that swallowed wagon wheels to the hub, and Garrett's road crew was out there again, working with boards and gravel and considerable profanity, trying to make the route passable before the summer commerce season demanded it. Eliza fed them lunch for 4 days running. This time, there was no interference, no redirected arrangements, no competing offer from the hotel. Garrett brought his 12 men at noon, and they ate in shifts, the same as before. And when they left on the 4th day, he told her they'd be back through in June for the next section of work, and he'd let her know ahead of time so she could plan. She wrote it in her ledger, June. 12 men, 4 days. These were the things her life was made of now. Forward-looking entries in a ledger, commitments written down because they were real enough to plan around. 6 months ago, she'd been doing arithmetic on 40 cents. Now she was scheduling months ahead. She didn't let herself forget the distance between those 2 points. She thought it was important not to forget it, not to torture herself with it, not to be constantly looking over her shoulder at how bad things had been, but to keep it present enough that she stayed honest about what things actually cost and what they were actually worth. Marcus Vale's dining room was still open. This was something she'd expected to change after his visit to her kitchen, but it hadn't, and when she thought about it clearly, she understood why. The hotel's dining room was not just his income. It was the skeleton of his identity in Dust Hollow, the thing that had made him substantial for 20 years. You don't close that because you've had an illness and a moment of reflection. You don't close it because you sent an empty pot back with a thank you message. He was not a changed man in the way conversion stories describe changed men. Sudden, complete, permanent. He was a man who'd been shaken by something and was deciding slowly what to do with the shaking. Pete still cooked, the dining room still served, the hotel still operated, but something had shifted in the competition between them, or rather, something had stopped. The active campaign was over. The flowers stayed on Hobart's shelves. The council received no further complaints about her kitchen. The rumors that had moved through Dust Hollow's channels dried up. What remained was simply 2 establishments in the same small town, operating at different scales for different purposes, coexisting in the way of things that have stopped fighting without quite becoming friendly. She could live with that. She was living with it. It was Elias who told her about the plates. He came by on a Thursday evening in late April. Not his usual time, not his usual manner, carrying something that gave him a slightly different energy than his customary settled calm. He sat down on the bench near the door, which was where he always sat, and looked at the stove for a moment before he said anything. "Vale came to see me today," he said. She looked up from the counter. "He wants to commission something," Elias said. "For you." "For me." "A set of iron pot hooks, for the wall above the stove. Better than what you've got." He paused. He specified the design himself. He drew it out, came in with a sketch. He seemed to find this detail worth noting. A man like Marcus Vale arriving at a blacksmith's shop with a pencil sketch. "He wants to pay for it. He asked me not to tell you it was from him until they were made." She was quiet for a moment. "But you're telling me," she said. "I thought you should know," Elias said, "before they show up." She turned this over in her mind. A man commissioning ironwork for his enemy's kitchen, specifying the design, drawing a sketch, asking for it to be done anonymously, which Elias had chosen not to honor because she knew Elias well enough by now to understand this. He thought deception, even benevolent deception, was inferior to straightforwardness. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I said I'd make them." He looked at his hands. "Is that all right?" "Yes," she said. "That's all right." She went back to work, but she thought about it for the rest of the evening, about a man expressing something he didn't have the direct language for, translating it into iron and craftsmanship, using someone else's hands to say what his own mouth hadn't found the words for yet. She thought, that's not nothing, that's actually something. The pot hooks arrived 10 days later, mounted by Elias himself on a Saturday morning while she was doing service. They were good work. Clean lines, functional, with a slight curve at the end that was more elegant than anything the kitchen had previously contained. She hung her 3 heaviest pots on them and stepped back and looked at the wall. May said, "Those are nice." "They are," Eliza said. She didn't explain where they'd come from. May probably had a guess. May usually had a guess. The moment that closed the circle, or rather, that let her understand there was no clean circle, that some things just changed their shape, and you lived with the new shape, came on a Saturday afternoon in May. She was alone in the kitchen. May had gone home. Abigail had finished for the day. The service was done, and the cleaning was done, and the prep for Sunday was done, and she was sitting on her stool with her ledger open on the table, doing the weekly accounting that had become as much a ritual as anything else in her life. The numbers were good, better than good by the standard of October. Not extraordinary, not the kind of success that got written about anywhere, but solid and real and built from the kind of work that doesn't collapse when someone looks at it directly. There was a knock at the door. She said, "Come in," expecting May or Sully or someone who'd heard she sometimes had pie in the late afternoon if she'd made extra. Marcus Vale opened the door. He was dressed better than he'd been during his illness, but not as formally as he'd carried himself in the months before it. There was a middle register to him now that she hadn't seen before. Less performance, less armor. He was a man of about 55, she'd calculated at some point, and he looked his age in a way that the authority had previously obscured. He was carrying something. It was a set of plates, 4 of them, stacked and wrapped in a cloth, which he held carefully in both hands. The hotel's plates, she recognized as he unwrapped them. Fine china, cream-colored with a blue border, the kind that would have cost more than her weekly earnings when she arrived in Dust Hollow. "These were my mother's," he said. "She brought them west when she came out here. She thought—" He stopped. He started again. "She thought wherever you put good dishes was home. That was her idea about it." Eliza looked at the plates. "I want you to have them," he said. She said nothing for a moment. "Mr. Vale—" "Marcus," he said. Not warmly, not with the ease of actual friendship, but with the specific correction of someone who understands that surnames between 2 people who have been through what they'd been through was a formality neither of them needed to maintain. "Marcus," she said. "Those are your mother's." "Yes." He set them on the table carefully, one at a time. 4 plates, cream and blue, sitting on her green oilcloth. She would have liked this place. He said it simply, looking around the kitchen, the wall hooks, the shelf, the sign above the door visible through the window. She liked places where things were honestly made. She looked at the plates for a long time. "I can't give these back to you," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm not expecting you to." He stood for another moment. He looked at the tin on the table, the one with the dried grasses, brown and long past their best and still there, still holding their approximate shape. "You should replace those," he said. "I know," she said. "I keep not getting around to it." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Then he put his hat on and went to the door. "You built something good here," he said. "I made it harder than it needed to be." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "You did." He nodded. He went out. She sat with the plates for a while. The afternoon light came through the shutter at an angle and hit the blue border of the nearest plate and made it look for a moment like something from a different world. A world where tables were set properly and rooms were warm and you didn't have to fight for the right to feed people. She thought about her mother's letter. "I hope you're warm enough out there." She thought about her mother, who had given her a recipe for biscuits and an imperfect love and a cast-iron skillet, and who had probably never understood how much any of it mattered. And she thought about a man's mother carrying china plates west, believing that wherever you put beautiful things was home. Home was not a place that accepted you. She understood this now in a way she hadn't when she'd arrived. Home was a place you made real through the sustained work of being present in it. By summer, the kitchen had outgrown itself. Not dramatically. Nothing about what Eliza built happened dramatically. But the consistent pressure of too many people in too small a space had produced the specific problem of not being able to grow what she'd built without physical change. She was turning people away on busy days, which was the kind of problem that felt like a good problem until you added up what it was costing her. She talked to Elias about it. He listened, as he always did, without interrupting. The freight barn wall, he said when she was done. The kitchen shares it. The barn's underused on the north side. If the barn owner agreed, you could knock through and expand into that space. Who owns the barn? Elias looked at her. She looked at him. Vale owns the barn, she said. Vale owns the barn, he confirmed. She sat with this for a moment. The particular flavor of it, having to go back to Marcus Vale for the one thing she needed to grow, was not comfortable. It had a quality of irony that was too neat, too much like a lesson someone had designed, and real life's lessons were rarely that tidy. But it was what it was. She went to see him. She found him in his hotel, in his office, which was smaller than she'd imagined. A practical room, papers organized on a desk, a single window facing the main street. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face settled, the way people's faces settle when they see someone they've been expecting. She sat down without being invited, which was something she'd learned she could do. She explained what she needed. The north wall of the freight barn, access to expand the kitchen space into a portion of the unused side. She'd pay rent for it. She named a number, which was the honest number she'd calculated against her earnings, not a lowball. He listened. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. The number you named, he said. Yes. It's low. She held his gaze. It's what I can pay. He picked up a pen. He set it down. He looked at the window. Half that, he said. She stared at him. Half is less than what I offered. I know. He met her eyes. The other half you can consider. He stopped, searching for the word. Settlement, he said finally. For the flower. The room was quiet. She understood that this was the only way a man like Marcus Vale could pay a debt that had no formal currency, not with an apology that felt sufficient, because no apology would, but with a concrete, practical reduction in what she owed him. He was making it a transaction because transactions were the language he knew, but the transaction was carrying something that wasn't transactional at all. She could refuse it. She thought about refusing it. All right, she said. Elias knocked through the wall in July, with help from Tom, who had added construction work to his repertoire of odd jobs, and turned out to be more competent at it than anyone expected, including Tom. May's younger sister, who had been watching the kitchen operation with undisguised ambition for months, was hired to work full days. Abigail was given additional responsibility and a small wage increase that she accepted with the seriousness of someone who understood the weight of being valued. The expanded kitchen was not beautiful. The new section had a lower ceiling and a different floor, and it took 2 months before it stopped smelling like freight barn. But it was space, real space, and she built a second table in it and set out benches, and the room could hold 20 people at a time if they were friendly about it. She put Marcus Vale's china plates on the shelf where people could see them. Not because she was making a statement, not as performance, but because they were beautiful, and the kitchen deserved beautiful things, and they had come to her honestly, if through a long and difficult route, and that seemed like enough reason. Sully came through in August, his rig finally repaired in a lasting way. He'd replaced the entire axle assembly, he explained, after the fabricated piece Elias had made were down faster than expected, which he did not hold against Elias because a fabrication is a fabrication and only the real thing lasts. He sat at the table and drank his coffee and looked around the expanded room. You've gotten bigger, he said. A little. I told a man in Laramie about this place, he said. He'll be through in September. Thank you. He drank his coffee. He was the same as he'd always been. The red beard now slightly more gray at the edges, the manner of a man who moved through the world without fuss and expected the world to return the favor. You doing all right? He asked. It was the first time he'd asked her anything personal, she realized. In all the months, all the breakfasts, the familiarity of routine, he'd never asked that. Yes, she said. She thought about it properly, the way the question deserved. Better than all right, I think. He nodded. Good, he said. That was all. But from Sully, it was enough. She wrote to her mother again in August. It was a longer letter than the first one. She told her about the kitchen, not the whole story, not the license, and the flour and the rats that weren't there. All of that was too long and too complicated for a letter. But she told her about the expanded room. She told her about May and Abigail. She told her about Brenner's flour and Ruth and the mining camps. She told her about Elias making the stove work. She told her about the biscuits. She said, "I use your recipe. I've changed it some, but the foundation is yours. People come from miles for them. I thought you should know that what you taught me is still teaching people, even here." She folded the letter and sealed it and sent it south. She didn't know if it would be enough to close the distance between them. She didn't know if distance like that fully closed, or whether it just became manageable enough that you could live on both sides of it without constantly bleeding. But she sent the letter because sending it was honest, and honesty was the thing she'd found herself most committed to, not as an abstract virtue, but as a practical one. Honest about the ingredients, honest about the money, honest about what she could offer and what she couldn't. Honest about what had happened with Marcus Vale, which was not a redemption story in the clean sense, but something more human. Two people who had been in opposition, altered by the opposition, arriving at a state that was more complicated and more livable than either of them had planned. There is a thing that happens when you look back on a hard period from the other side of it. You start to see it wrong. You start to make it simpler than it was. The struggle becomes more heroic, the villain more cartoonish, the triumph more complete. Memory does this because the mind prefers patterns to mess, and the mess of real experience is uncomfortable to hold without cleaning it up a little. Eliza was aware of this tendency. She'd watched herself do it with smaller things, with days that had been difficult in ways that blurred together, smoothed out in recollection into a general hard time rather than the specific grinding sequence of mornings she hadn't wanted to face. She tried to resist it about the bigger thing. She tried to remember it accurately, that it had been genuinely frightening, not exciting, that she'd made mistakes she hadn't always acknowledged, that she hadn't been purely patient or purely dignified or purely anything. She'd been human, which meant she'd had moments of real anger that she'd managed into stillness, moments of self-pity she'd talked herself out of, moments of doubt that she hadn't been able to dispel by willpower alone, that had only resolved when more time passed and more things went right. She'd also benefited from people she might not have given enough credit to. Elias, whose quiet help had been so consistent she'd sometimes forgotten to notice it. May, who was 14 and wise in the specific way of someone who'd grown up paying attention. Clara, whose frankness had been a form of respect, treating Eliza as someone capable of handling the truth rather than someone who needed protection from it. Sully, whose ordinary loyalty, showing up, eating, paying, coming back, had been worth more than he knew. Pete, whose conscience had overridden his employment and cost him something, probably, that she'd never fully seen. Even Dora Fitch's dried herbs. The small gesture of someone who'd been used badly and knew it and tried, in the only way she had available, to make something right. None of these people had been perfect. None of them had been entirely selfless. The help had come mixed with self-interest, with caution, with the ordinary human limitation of people who are mostly trying to manage their own lives and occasionally make room for someone else's. That was the thing she most wanted to say about it, if she were ever in a position to say something, that it wasn't a story about exceptional people doing exceptional things. It was a story about ordinary people doing enough. Enough to make the difference, just enough, on the days when it mattered, and one woman who refused to accept the story someone else had written for her. The dried grasses finally came out of the tin in September. She replaced them with a bunch of late-season wildflowers that a girl had been selling from a basket on the main street, small yellow ones whose name she didn't know, and some dried lavender she'd found at Hobart's store, and a spray of something purple that had no name she was aware of. She arranged them without much deliberation, the way you do when you're not trying to make something look good, but just putting things where they seem like they should go. She set the tin back on the table. May looked at it when she came in. "Those are nice," she said. "I had the old ones too long," Eliza said. "Yes," May agreed. "You really did." Eliza looked at the flowers for a moment. Then she looked at the room. The two tables, the benches, the shelves with the china plates, and the rows of supplies, and the hanging pots on the iron hooks that Marcus Vale had drawn a sketch for. The sign above the door with her name on it. The stove that Elias had built right, and that had been drawing clean for 11 months. She looked at what she'd made. Not perfect, not finished. A thing like this was never finished. It just kept becoming the next version of itself, requiring the same daily attention that it had always required. But real. Genuinely, solidly real, in the way that things are real when they've been tested and held.
She thought about the man in the hotel who'd handed her a rusted key. She thought about who she'd been when she took it, frightened, certain she'd made an error, standing in a broken room in October with $17.40 and her mother's skillet and the particular determination of someone who has run out of alternatives and decided to call that freedom.
She thought about who she was now. Not transformed, not remade into something different, the same person with the same weight, the same history, the same family that had loved her badly and taught her well and sent her letters that arrived late and meant more than they knew how to say. The same woman who cried sometimes at night when she was too tired for the armor to stay up, who made mistakes in the kitchen and corrected them without announcing it, who had days of doubt that she didn't share with anyone because some things were hers to carry privately. But that woman was standing in a room she'd built, in a town that knew her name, having fed more people than she could count, and asked only that they come back if it was worth coming back to. Most of them came back. That was the whole story, really. Not that she'd defeated anyone, not that she'd proved something to the people who doubted her. She hadn't set out to prove anything, not at its core, and proof wasn't the point. The point was the work. The daily, unglamorous, specific work of making something good and keeping it good and getting up before 4 a.m. to do it again. There is a version of this kind of life that the world overlooks entirely. The woman behind the freight barn. The person no one expected anything from. The quiet persistence that doesn't make a dramatic scene and doesn't hand you a moment of obvious victory to point to. It just builds, day by day, meal by meal, until one morning you look up, and the thing you built is more real than the obstacles that tried to prevent it. That is not a small thing. In a life where the world is constantly telling certain people what they cannot be and what they cannot do and what they should understand about their own limitations, to simply keep building anyway, without waiting for permission, without requiring the approval of people who have already decided you don't deserve it, that is not a small thing at all. Eliza Harper had come to Dust Hollow with a suitcase, a skillet, and $17.40. She had stayed, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and outside on the freight road the wagons were moving, and somewhere on that road someone had just heard about a place in Dust Hollow where the food was worth the trip. They were already on their way.